This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies, and today I'm pleased to announce the transition of our podcast from Intelligence Matters to its new title, NatSec Matters. The new name reflects our broader focus on the many issues shaping the national security landscape, and we're thrilled to begin this exciting new chapter. As always, we remain committed to delivering thoughtful, informed discussions on the critical issues that impact our world. Today I'm joined by Mr. Peter Rao, a senior fellow and director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute. Peter is also the principal and founder of Hilltop Solutions, LLC. He previously served as the director of research for the Office of George W. Bush and as an associate director in the White House Office of Strategic Initiatives. Mr. Rao joins us today for a discussion on the latest developments from the front lines of Ukraine and the outlook of the recently signed ceasefire in the Black Sea. Stay with us as we speak with Mr. Peter Rao. Peter, thanks so much for joining us on National Security Matters.
Thanks for having me. As they say in talk radio, long-time listener, first-time caller. So I appreciate being on the show.
Well, we're glad to have you. Peter, you just got back from Ukraine. Let's just start right there. Can you outline for us some of your major takeaways from the trip?
Well, I think my first major takeaway would be that the situation militarily is relatively stable. Obviously, Russia's success in pushing Ukraine out of its pocket in Kursk Oblast in the Russian Federation has dominated headlines. And there have been some successful localized counterattacks by what is probably Ukraine's best commander, a new commander around Pokrovsk in Ukraine. But by and large, I think the military situation is relatively stable. I did not leave Ukraine thinking that defeat is on the horizon, let alone imminent. Where the action really has been, I think, is in the diplomatic and political spheres, where obviously there's been a whole host of developments since the Trump administration's come into office. I'd also say that the issue which commanded the most attention at the White House during that disastrous meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, namely Ukraine's struggle with manpower and mobilization, was downplayed a bit by the Ukrainians. Now, that might be that they're now extremely sensitive to this issue, but as one interlocutor and Ukrainian leader after another emphasized to my colleagues and I who were on the trip, they seem to be in decent shape on mobilization, on manpower, on force development. They have something like 1 million men under arms spread out over 101 brigades, which is pretty sizable. So that major issue, which has been the dominant problem for Ukraine since at least the U.S. passed its last supplemental in the spring of last year under the Biden administration. So on the weapons front, shoring up Ukraine, the manpower topic has been dominant, and they seem to be in decent shape. So I guess to summarize that long-winded answer, on the military situation, I came away relatively pleased or relatively optimistic about Ukraine's fortunes, and then a lot of the discussion really centered and gravitated to the political side.
All right, so before we get to the diplomatic stuff, let me just mention on the military situation, most people say that the Russians are continuing to make incremental gains, but the square mileage that they take per day or per month or whatever is down. Is that consistent with what you learned?
Yeah, Russia is incrementally inching forward at enormous pain and suffering. Their losses have ranged anywhere from 12 to 1,300 upwards to 2,000 casualties a day. That's killed and wounded. And they have slowly but surely slogged their way forward. Meanwhile, Ukraine's sort of husbanded its resources, tried to preserve its manpower, and has really sought to overcome both manpower and artillery shortages with its enormously promising drone program, where they've become world leaders. I will say on the artillery front, actually, Ukraine is probably in the best shape it's been in since right before it launched that ill-fated counteroffensive in the summer of 2023. What we heard from different military commanders is that ratio might be down to 1 to 2, 1 to 3, at worst 1 to 4, depending upon which sector we're talking about, where Russia has an advantage. At times that had been like 1 to 7 or 1 to 10 in between supplementals. So on the artillery front, they're in decent shape. On drone production, it's really impressive. And then, the Russians are basically throwing forward men to try to slowly but surely take as much as they can and finish up Luhansk, then obviously Donetsk, and then those two other regions, Zaporizhia and Kherson.
That's new. I mean, I've been hearing that manpower is the most acute problem and that they were not in a great position right now. But you think that's on the way to being solved or relatively under control?
Well, you might be right. It's just that since this issue has now become, you and I are veterans of the Bush administration. If you remember in 2005, Social Security reform, the third rail of politics, it might be that manpower has become the third rail of Ukrainian politics, especially after the vice president's and President Zelensky's exchange in the Oval, to where the Ukrainians are just very sensitive on this issue. But so maybe I'm being spun, but across the board, I think we heard pretty promising news on the manpower front.
Okay, so what do you think Ukraine's diplomatic strategy is? I remember at one point being briefed a few months back that once Trump was elected, they wanted to put themselves in a situation where they were not seen as the obstacle to peace. So the Oval Office meeting notwithstanding, do you think that's still their strategy, to try and spotlight Russian potential obstinates?
Yeah, I think when I was there just after the Jeddah talks, this is the first round of Ukraine-U.S. consultations that have taken place at any length since the Trump administration came into office in Saudi Arabia. We arrived in Kyiv just after that, and the Ukrainians were, I think, riding high because they thought they were back on side with the Americans. And clearly their goal is to make clear to the U.S. that they view themselves as a strategic partner. They are not going to be the obstacle to peace. They've embraced some of President Trump's goals of peacemaking, while at the same time pushing for additional elements, which the administration has been hesitant, if not loath, to provide, like a security guarantee, and to show that the Russians really are the obstacle, that Putin is the one who's engaged in barbarism here, who has no interest in partnering with the U.S. And that really, I think, is the diplomatic dance we're seeing up to the present moment. But right after Jeddah, which was an excellent meeting, the president's right-hand man, President Zelensky's right-hand man, Andriy Yermak, and the foreign minister led the Ukrainian delegation, and then Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisor were leading the American delegation. I think they thought that they had a really productive and solid meeting. And then as Secretary Rubio was able to say after that meeting, the onus is now on the Russians, or the ball's in the Russian court.
Yeah. Do you think that they are excited or going along very tentatively with the Trump plan? I mean, they've agreed on a ceasefire as it pertained to attacks on energy infrastructure. Next is the Black Sea, trying to make sure there's no military activity down there. What's your sense of just sort of the incremental steps going forward? And do you take Trump's rhetoric to be, as the media narrative is, that he's too pro-Russian, or do you think he's really trying to put himself as a fair intermediary?
Well, to tackle the first question first, I think that the Ukrainians went to Jeddah with a proposal to freeze the attacks in the air and at sea, and that a partial ceasefire would be easiest to monitor, since this is an incredibly long front line, and the Ukrainians are convinced, rightfully so, that the Russians will cheat or will try to provoke Ukraine, and it's difficult to monitor all of that on land. And so they offered a partial ceasefire to the U.S., and the U.S. came back with a counterproposal arguing for a comprehensive ceasefire, which I think is much more fitting or befitting Donald Trump's style and the president's approach, which is to have a big headline and to go for a comprehensive package right off the bat. Ukraine basically agreed to that and said, okay, if that's what you, United States, would like to do, if that's the direction you want to proceed, we're prepared to go that route after consulting with President Zelensky and the commanders on the ground. That's what the negotiating team basically answered. And I think, again, that goes back to your earlier question, which is Ukraine's strategy is to be on side with the United States. Now, I think in return, they wanted a lifting of both the intelligence freeze and the weapons freeze, which the U.S. had instituted after the Zelensky-Trump Oval Office meeting. And they got that, in part because I think Ukraine thought it was demoralizing and dispiriting for its own forces. I don't think it had a huge battlefield effect, given the short-lived nature of it, but it did matter to them. So, the Ukrainians are prepared to go along with the U.S. strategy. What I think they're worried about is that the Russians are going to attach conditions every step of the way. They're going to cheat. They're going to drag out negotiations and push for more in a way that becomes disadvantageous for Kyiv and advantageous for Moscow. And so they're wanting to show Ukraine is that they're team players, while also warning the U.S. or trying to make sure that the Americans and the Europeans recognize Russia can be a problem here.
Let me jump in here, and then we'll come back to Trump, because let me follow up on that question. Do you think the Ukrainians secretly want a ceasefire because they need to reconstitute their arms and give their army a rest?
The Ukrainians definitely want to reconstitute their armed forces, and they want to give their soldiers a rest. But their analysis is, what is the relative status of forces right now? If Russia is going to be able, and during a ceasefire, to continue to churn out all sorts of military kit, continue recruiting soldiers, and basically increase or grow its advantage over Ukraine, so that if hostilities resume, Ukraine's in a weaker position, then they're not thrilled about a ceasefire. If, however, a ceasefire means that Ukraine can continue to build up its military infrastructure, meaning they're getting support from the West, financing in particular, and they manage to connect to it some sort of security guarantee, Western force deployment, then it's something that they'd be delighted by. But that also depends what we mean by ceasefire. I think a ceasefire, as it's kind of narrowly construed, makes sense to them, or they're happy to entertain, in particular, a 30-day ceasefire. An armistice, or an actual cessation of hostilities that would stretch out over a longer period of time, that's where that calculation I just described, I think, comes in most dramatically.
Okay. So back to, how do you think President Trump is playing this? Do you think that he is trying to be an honest broker, or do you think that he's shading too much to the Russian side?
Well, I don't think the Ukrainians believe that the U.S. sees itself. I mean, first of all, let's just back up. And Secretary Rubio has made this point. I think it merits making and pointing out. There are U.S. support packages going to Ukraine. There are sanctions being levied against the Russians. And so it's a little unfair to say that the U.S. is operating somewhere between Ukraine and Russia rather than on side with Ukraine, because those dynamics are in play. Having said that, the direction of travel, I think, seems pretty clear. The U.S. sees itself as a mediator between Moscow and Kyiv, more so than it views itself as a strategic partner of Ukraine. I think everything we've heard from Special Envoy Witkoff, from the president, from the vice president, suggests that they want to bring this conflict to a close and forge a new partnership with Russia. So they view themselves as sitting somewhere between those two actors, rather than, I think, on the side of Kyiv, which is how the Biden administration understood itself. Those two elements I described, the weapons and sanctions, are the two most powerful things the U.S. does for Ukraine. I don't think there is much appetite for another congressional supplemental. There's never been a congressional supplemental in American history that an administration hasn't asked for. So the administration would have to ask. And I have yet to see the U.S. publicly argue that the critical minerals deal is a way to finance supplementals going forward, or underwrite supplementals, or any creative proposals that say have the Europeans sending €2 for every $1 for future supplementals. I just don't see an appetite for it at all. Now, perhaps that'll change. Maybe now that congressional negotiations over the CR, et cetera, will begin to wrap up, although there's other pressing business, we will turn to that. But this issue will come due in the early summer, and I think the administration, and we saw this with J.D. Vance's exchange with Niall Ferguson on Twitter, where he basically kind of dismisses Niall Ferguson's comment. He's like, "What's your idea? Another supplemental?" And that sort of derision, I think, suggests the vice president doesn't think that's a viable option. And then the second, on sanctions, the agreement we saw yesterday heading into today between the U.S. and Russia over the Black Sea, I think, is testing the waters for a step-stair approach to sanctions relief. And clearly, if I could summarize it, the way I think the U.S. sees it is the issue of Ukraine is going to be solved in that we make a big offer to the Russians, encouraging them or inviting them into a new strategic relationship. And all the allure of that might persuade the Russians to shut this war down amicably. But it's not the Biden administration track or what some, I think, hawks in Congress and elsewhere might advocate, which is that you have to back Ukraine with a tightening of sanctions on Russia with additional weapons package to put pain and pressure on Putin so that he arrives at that conclusion. It's much more inducement, much more carrots than it is sticks.
Got it.
And by the way, just as a final wrap up, Zelensky, taking that metaphor forward in his interview with Newsweek this week, said he's fine with carrots provided that they're poisoned.
All right. Before we get to Western force deployments and other security assurances, did you get a sense when you were in Ukraine of how long Ukraine can hold out without additional U.S. weapons assistance? I mean, I've seen estimates of 6 months. Did you get anything reliable, you think?
There's probably a little bit of hide the ball here too, because the Ukrainians have an incentive to get this process going in D.C. But I would guess that they'll start feeling the real effects of this in early summer, and then it will grow worse as the months go on. And while Europe can definitely fill the void, just as Ukraine is creatively filling the void on manpower and artillery shortages with drones, there are certain systems that only the U.S. can provide. I mean, how often do we hear President Zelensky talk about the importance and the irreplaceability of Patriot interceptors, for example, in air defense? The SAM-T, the French-Italian system, I think one interceptor takes like 24 months or something like that to produce. I heard a Russia analyst recently say it's like little elves in a workshop are making these interceptors. It takes far too long. And so, and the Patriots are battle tested. They're actually able to intercept ballistic and aeroballistic missiles. So anyways, I think from Starlink to and ISR to air defenses like the Patriots, the U.S. has proven pretty essential, which isn't to say the Ukrainians will just lay down. If they're pressed too hard, they may just choose to continue fighting absent U.S. assistance, but it would make it pretty difficult.
Yeah, it makes it hard. All right, that point about Trump seeming more carrots than sticks right now is really interesting. When we talk about security assurances, we talk about maybe the British, the French, maybe the Germans, since they have a new government, being as, let's call it, tripwire peacekeepers inside of Ukraine. So the idea if Ukraine's not in NATO, we'll have NATO inside Ukraine. Do you think that's viable? I don't know whether the Russians would ever agree to that in the end. What's your sense of that idea?
I think it's almost a non-starter, not just because the Russians won't agree to it, but so the European strategy now, after asking for an American backstop, is basically to shift towards putting together as much power as they can, and then going to the United States and saying, can you fill out X, Y, and Z? So air defense, again, ISR, maybe heavy transport. I don't know, a few categories of systems where the Europeans are pretty reliant on the U.S. But what they really want is a political guarantee from the U.S. that in the event of hostilities, the United States would be there to support the Europeans in extremis if bullets start firing.
Does that mean more military assistance if bullets start flying?
No, that would mean that if say the Russians attacked, in your example you raised earlier, the countries you mentioned, German or French or British forces, then the U.S. cavalry would ride to their assistance to make sure that they're defended, and kind of, in effect, it's a backdoor Article 5, and it takes us back to the 2008 Bucharest summit and Ukraine's NATO invitation. And I just see no appetite from the administration to go that route.
Yeah.
In fact, we saw Special Envoy Witkoff, who was playing a very important role in this whole process, on Tucker Carlson, describing the British effort as a pose and posturing, even though Secretary Rubio in a readout, I think just the other day I read, thanked Foreign Minister Lamy of the UK for putting together or moving in this direction. It just seems to me like the Americans aren't going to want to be chain ganged into war as they see it. That's, I think, a strong ideological current in the White House. But separate from that, I just don't think the Europeans view themselves as having the requisite forces and power to do enough of it on its own without really concrete, not just American political guarantees, but probably American support on the ground. Just yesterday, I spoke to a very senior allied Western official who just dismissed this effort altogether and said, without the United States, it's not going to happen. I don't want to be totally cynical, but President Macron has been politically damaged and weakened in France. Everyone's followed that over the past few years, or if you haven't, he's very much so wounded. And so I think he saw an opportunity here, grabbed the flag, made several announcements. The British came in because they feel very sympathetic and important and supportive to Zelensky. But like in the end, now it's already considered a reassurance force. The tripwire idea has been cast aside. They don't want to deploy anywhere near the first, second, or third lines, but maybe somewhere in central Ukraine. And so I view this as, in the end, like the French have leaned so far out over their skis that they will probably dispatch some sort of training mission to Ukraine of several hundred troops that will be, I don't know, somewhere between Lviv and Kyiv, but nowhere near the front lines. And beyond that, I just don't see this effort getting off the ground. And if I'm right about that, then we wasted that whole week. If you think back to culminated in the Zelensky-Trump blow-up, where it started with President Duda in Washington at CPAC, then President Macron, then Prime Minister Starmer all came to Washington to try to make this pitch for an American guarantee or backstop. What I think we should really be focusing on is how do we arm the Ukrainians to the teeth? Because in the end, if they're going to deter Russian aggression, they're going to have to do it on their own with Western assistance as they have, rather than fighting side by side with the West, for which I don't think there's any appetite. And by the way, one last point, some of the countries that would be most inclined to deploy to support Ukraine because they've been most ardent in their support of Kyiv over the last 3 years are frontline states. That's why they feel the hot breath of Moscow on their backs, and they're most supportive of Ukraine. But they need their own forces, as they've argued, for territorial defense, for their own security challenges. And so a country like Poland isn't going to deploy. They've already taken that off the table. It'd have to be the big countries of Western Europe, and I just don't see it happen.
So, but are you making a distinction between a tripwire force, which is closer to the front lines, and training, which is possible as long as they're in the West somewhere?
Yeah, I think there could be some sort of European deployment to Ukraine, because at this point, it would be a pretty big step down and fallback if the Europeans aren't able to muster anything for Ukraine. But the type of force that actually helps Ukraine deter a Russian reinvasion after a ceasefire, if we manage to put one together, that I think is a whole different bag of chips or kettle of fish.
All right, well, here's the big question then. What is the most likely outcome for security assurances in a final status agreement, if you will, an armistice that you can foresee?
The best outcome would be that we manage a ceasefire in which Ukraine extracts hard and fast guarantees of Western support, meaning financing, military assistance, weapon systems, so that it can keep pace with Russia as Russia's war economy continues to churn out more and more military kit, and as Russia continues its mobilization apace. If that's the case, then I think the Russians, as one senior Ukrainian official put it to us in Kyiv, might conclude, look, Ukraine's is a pretty spiky porcupine, and after an armistice or after a ceasefire, we might increase our hybrid warfare information campaign. We might try to message Kyiv, look, you counted on the West didn't support you enough, but it won't actually be able to kind of take the rest of the country. And then Ukraine has a fighting chance to join the European Union, to continue its Western trajectory. By Ukraine, I mean vital Ukraine, sort of central and Western Ukraine, the parts that are not under occupation, and it can continue or can begin and continue to export certain commodities through its Black Sea port of Odessa, which is really the economic lifeline of the country. That's like where Ukraine has a future that's viable and real. But I don't think, the invasion plains of Europe are Poland in the north and Ukraine in the south, and Poland escaped Ukraine's fate through the pacifying effect of an American security guarantee because it managed to get under NATO's umbrella early, but Ukraine didn't, and so now it's dealt the deck of cards, to use what's now become an overused metaphor, and it's got to just try to hang on.
We're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back with more of our discussion with Mr. Peter Rao.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
What is your sense of the Trump administration? Do they believe what a lot of skeptics say, that the Russians will eventually reattack Ukraine, even if it's no longer when Trump is in office? Do you get a sense that they believe that?
That's a good question. I heard at least one actually it wasn't a Ukrainian, but official in Eastern Europe recently argued to me that President Bush had a great meeting with President Putin in 2001 in Ljubljana, a famous meeting where the two of them tried to build out a productive relationship. And then by 2008, he had invaded Georgia when the Bush administration was on its way out the door, meaning there wasn't enough time left to kind of respond, and it was handed off to the Obama team, which then went for a reset. So it might be that I don't think Putin is so obtuse that he's going to completely reject with an outright no whatever Donald Trump offers him, but he might take whatever offers are coming, and this seems to be the pattern already emerging, and say yes, however, and add a series of conditions to it. And then, if they do manage to get to a comprehensive ceasefire, which is by no ways assured, but let's stipulate that's the case. If in 3 or 4 years there is a reinvasion of Ukraine, so to speak, or the areas Ukraine, the government now controls, then the Trump administration might be able to argue, look, the Trump administration got you the ceasefire, but European weakness got you the reinvasion. Unlike Afghanistan, which is surrounded by weak states, if there is kind of a decent interval between cessation of hostilities and a reinvasion, you can argue in the case of Ukraine that there are strong states surrounding it, and Europe should be in a position and should be able to, at some point, to pick up the slack and support Ukraine. And that's kind of what Vice President Vance in that Signal chat, which is now famously been read around the world, seemed to be suggesting, like, we don't want to bail out the Europeans. They should, they need to take more responsibility for their own affairs. And so I think that might be one calculation. Another might be that, no, there's actually a real strategic partnership here because, the Russians and the Chinese are in bed together. And as President Trump has said publicly, and others have said in the administration, we want to pull the Russians away. So there's an opportunity to really offer them cooperation in places like the Arctic. Witkoff hinted at that with Tucker Carlson. And that's an alternative world where Ukraine kind of fades as a priority item and Russia sees new opportunities. And then a third might be that, there is an ideological streak. I don't know how high up this goes in the administration, but there are some who say, look, the West is hedonistic and Putin, the traditionalist, is reaching his hand across and over the LGBTQIA plus European Union to traditional America in an act of friendship, or wants a new relationship, and that really is more of the future than these budding caliphates in Europe owing to immigration trends. I think that's totally misreading Russia and probably gets things gets things wrong. But that might be there among some officials as well. I don't know.
Yeah, I've seen this traveling around. All right, so you're also the director of the Center for Europe and Eurasia over at the Hudson Institute. So let's talk a little bit about the Europeans. Do they have religion now that Trump is in office, that they're, quote, on their own, and so that they're going to legitimately spend money to develop their defense industries and in turn churn out weapons? Or are all these announcements of German additional and English additional spending, is this just something that's just going to take years and that they're still reliant upon the United States in a decade?
There's, I think, an element of truth in both. For one, the transition will take time because of the really pathetic state of parts of Europe's defense industry. And we're not totally innocent in this. I mean, we've built this transatlantic defense industry and defense process. And so for Europe to build up its own defense industrial base, among other things, will take time. They were basically lying flat on the floor, and now they're on their knees and they're on their way to standing up. But it'll probably take them a little time. Some announcements I think are more real than others. So the French, the Spanish budgetary situations are disastrous, and there really isn't a lot of room for increased defense spending, save they're prepared to run the types of deficits and debts that really will begin to hit them in the financial markets and begin to impact their fiscal standing around the world. And I don't think that's the case. Every day, if you follow French politics closely, you see a new political dispute over pensions and other areas of French spending, which really in the end have to be addressed by more economic growth. And we're not seeing the sort of innovation, demographic dynamism, and economic pluck that you need to be able to really put growth numbers on the table that allow for the financing of this. The country that, and by the way, I would add also the same applies still to the European Union, which has made some grand announcements, but as long as there isn't joint borrowing, which taps into the fiscal space that Northern Europe has, and the Northern Europeans do not want to finance the profligate South, then these are still just almost sort of like accountants moving numbers around an actuarial table rather than new monies that are being devoted. However, I will say the German announcement, the Danish announcement, these sorts of announcements are real because these are traditional savers with lots of fiscal space. And the German decision to exempt defense from its constitutional debt break means that you could have enormous sums of money devoted to defense. And the numbers we're talking about, really only 4 or 5 countries in the world could put together, like the Japanese, the United States, the PRC, and the Germans. And that's kind of the list. I mean, the British announcements are incremental. The French are trying to capture a lot of market share for their own industry, saying, don't buy Patriots, buy SAM-Ts, don't buy F-35s or F-47s, buy the Rafales. I think a lot of that's kind of classic French, Gaullist, almost protectionist defense rhetoric. But the German decision is a new one, and that could have major implications.
Okay. So as we begin to wrap up, let me put the big question to you. Do you think that in the final analysis that the United States would be able to, and I understand that you've said that gigantic supplemental appropriations are unlikely in this day and age, but do you think the Trump administration in the final analysis would agree to some level of U.S. military assistance flowing into Ukraine as a security assurance until the Europeans, let's say it's time limited, until we feel like the Europeans are ready and on their feet to assume the lion's share of it all? Do you think that Trump could get there in the end?
I think he can get there if it's hooked to final settlement or hooked to a major diplomatic breakthrough. So if Trump is going to be cast aloft as the great peacemaker who solved this problem, which eluded the Biden administration, and the price tag is some additional military support in certain key areas, perhaps underwritten by euros and the critical minerals of Ukraine, then I could see him saying that the price, the cost is worth the gain. If it's just as we've seen to date, kind of the next phase in what is an ongoing protracted conflict, and there seems to be little prospect of a diplomatic breakthrough, then I don't think that's the case. The middle ground is the real interesting question, which is if the Russians continue to drag out negotiations, attach conditions, and are increasingly viewed as the obstreperous party that's unwilling to entertain the president's offer or continues to muck them up with their own counter demands, in a fit of pique and frustration, recognizing that it has to change the dynamics, is the president prepared to put more military kit into Ukraine and even ratchet up the sanctions. To date, the direction of travel has been the opposite, that he's entertained the conditions to a certain extent. He's willing to begin testing sanctions relief over the Black Sea deal that was announced in the last 24 hours, and he doesn't seem to be inclined to do new supplementals. So it's an invitation to the Russians. But, Donald Trump is known to hug somebody with one hand and slap them with the other, and we'll see whether or not that embrace to date turns into kind of an iron fist if things don't work out for him.
Okay, so you've shrewdly outlined that it may be that when it comes to Russia, we're more carrots than sticks, which to me means sanctions relief at a minimum. We've talked about the unlikelihood of a gigantic supplemental and it being speculative at best whether the United States would be willing to supply Ukraine with additional weapons assistance in the medium term. So what are the minimum Ukrainian demands? What do they need to succeed and sign up to this, do you think?
Well, there are a couple of almost sort of suicidal conditions that the Russians are trying to force in the negotiations. One are caps on Ukraine's armed forces, and limits to Ukraine's military build out, which the Ukrainians under no conditions will agree to. The Ukrainians also are not going to give up parts of the right now four of the 5 oblasts, but in particular Zaporizhia and Kherson, 2 oblasts where they control sizable chunks of territory that Russia has officially annexed. So I was in Kherson, right up to the Dnieper River. This is now officially Russian territory. Ukrainians are not gonna give that up unless the Russians take it from them forcefully. So one is they're gonna insist on their military remaining strong and building that out further. 2, they're gonna insist on keeping control of their own territory. They're gonna push the West not to de jure recognize Russian control of those areas, even if de facto it's the case. And they're going to they're probably going to want. I mean, I don't know if this is a red line, but they don't want anyone dictating their future geopolitical orientation, even if they realize that NATO is not on the cards anytime soon. The Russians seem to have relented potentially on EU membership. And they need access to the Black Sea, which, to quote a senior official, is existential for their future. Things they would like are more co-production and licensing for the defense industrial base, tougher export controls on foreign components for the Russian weapons, tighter sanctions against Russian oil and gas. But some of those things are negotiable based on how things go.
Yeah, well, some of those sound rather doable. I mean, access to the Black Sea, Russia not getting territory that they haven't already taken. I know that's a maximalist demand of Putin's, that he wants some of the southern provinces, even if his military hasn't even taken it.
I mean, the last one that's going to be that gets brought up nonstop and in the press is security guarantees. But even there, I think they realize they're not going to get, like, if there's a re-invasion, an automatic NATO Article 5. Prime Minister Maloney actually floated this in the Chamber of Deputies the other day. But I think they realize that's not going to happen. But they do want support so that they don't lose the race. They don't lose the peace in a ceasefire, so to speak.
Okay. Last question. Let's end with this. What are the chances? Clients make me do this. This is hard. What are the chances that we have a ceasefire? And then what are the chances that, by that I mean a complete ceasefire? And then what are the chances that we later have anything that you might call an armistice or a peace agreement?
Well, to pick up that theme that they use in the Oval Office, neither Ukraine on who has the cards. If you remember that exchange between Trump and Zelensky, one Ukrainian put it to me last week. Neither Ukraine nor Russia have the cards. Trump has the cards, and the president wants a ceasefire badly. I mean, this is his overriding objective, and I think the Russians will extract a series of conditions for that ceasefire, and I think the U.S. is likely to go along in pursuit of a broader strategic partnership with Russia, but also because President Trump wants to be known as a peacemaker. And in the end, I think you cannot push the Ukrainians too far. I mean, things need to go through their own Rada, their own parliament, and no one's going to commit political suicide in Ukraine. And Zelensky has to be able to sell this to his public. But they will be forced to eat some parts of an agreement that they will resist, but in the end, we'll probably have little choice but to accept. I think if you put a gun to my head and made me choose, I would say that they're more likely to get a ceasefire than not. But I don't believe in that in the long run that this war will be settled in a permanent way.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just Russia covets Ukraine, and there's no way around that.
Well, what if Putin's not in office anymore?
Yeah, I put that question to a lot of people, and I think the next generation of leaders are likely to be the sons, maybe the daughters, but definitely the sons of the current FSB clique and elite that's around Putin from the security sector, and maybe they are kind of decrepit and hedonistic, and they just want access to the Spanish coast again and to Marseille and the shopping centers of London, and they'll just pursue that and leave all of this kind of imperial glory to others. But that's not really the character of Russia, and doesn't really reflect Russian history. So I think first of all, Putin isn't going anywhere. All this talk about him, dying of cancer, I think is sort of like when we would read Bin Laden as being pale and yellows and with kidney dialysis, and then Kim Jong-un was going to die during COVID, and Fidel Castro was on his deathbed. I mean, these are oftentimes predictions that it seems like they're a chalice of life. The guy lives another 10 years after that. So I think Putin's going to be around for a while, I would suspect, and at least in that period, I don't see any change. And after that, we're likely to see a leadership struggle, transition, like we have in the past in Russian history. And right now, there's no kind of urbane cosmopolitan elite, like, artists in St. Petersburg who are likely to take over. If anything, it's a hardline society that's pissed because the West supported Ukraine. And the critique of Putin is not that he's wrong to wage the war, he's waged it too soft. And that does not augur well for the period after Putin.
Yeah. And do you credit at all this idea that Donald Trump is truly trying to break Russia away from China? Or do you think more it's that our president, respects powerful nations, and that's more of what he's trying to do here?
Well, I think they're both in play. On the one hand, if you're going to play on the chessboard, you have to respect countries that have positions of power established across that chessboard. And countries like Turkey, which basically defeated Russia in Libya, defeated Russia in Syria now, is a major player. Russia has established positions of power from, Kaliningrad and the Baltics down through Belarus and into the Crimean Peninsula. These are sort of like anti-access area denial bubbles they've set up all across Central and Eastern Europe that are challenging to the U.S. And so I think Trump sees positions of power and thinks, all right, who controls those positions? It's the Russian president. I need to go through him to change things. And so I think Trump doesn't see any negotiation, which just the pixie dust of Trumpian flair won't solve. And he wants to get in there himself to kind of knead the dough and work the issue. But then I also think ideologically they probably came into office, they got their security briefings, and they realized that, and he said this on the campaign as well, the closeness between Beijing and Moscow is a problem, and they want to see if they can split that. I think it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, for a variety of reasons we don't have to get into, but that's definitely driving it. And then maybe if I could add one more point, which I think, I think makes me more sympathetic of President Trump than maybe some others would be. We do have, and I hear this a lot from Trump officials, we do have a problem in our strategic stockpiles. I mean, even Admiral Paparo from Indo-PACOM, during the Biden administration, the waning days when the policy was very pro-Ukraine, went public and said that his magazines for Patriot interceptors are going dangerously low. So I do at least appreciate the argument that we are not revving up production at the rate at which we are sending some of these systems to the European theater, and that makes us worry over something like a Taiwan contingency. I think that's a good faith argument that makes sense to me. I think we should be able to address it and support Ukraine, but it's a real worry.
Okay, Peter, we're lucky to have you. Thank you. You're a shrewd analyst on these particular issues. So thank you for joining National Security Matters.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
That was Peter Rao. I'm Michael Allen, and please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.